Hey guys, welcome back. Today, we're going to be analyzing what is probably the biggest component of economics, demand. First of all, what is demand? Demand represents the various quantities of a good that consumers are willing and able to buy at different possible prices during a particular time period, assuming all other factors remain constant, or, as economists say, ceteris paribus. Remember, the concept of ceteris paribus means if everything else stays the same. The economy is a very complicated system, and there are many variables that are constantly changing. Because of that, there is nothing in economics that is always true. There are always exceptions. So to help simplify things, we use ceteris paribus to isolate variables to see how changing that one variable affects the whole system if nothing else changes, or ceteris paribus. Throughout this video, we need to assume ceteris paribus for these concepts to be true. So just remember, even if I don't say it, ceteris paribus is being used for this entire lesson. Going back to the definition, the words willing and able are crucial. For instance, I'm certainly willing to buy a Lamborghini, but since I'm not able, my desire isn't reflected in the demand curve. This is where the economics definition of demand differs from the general definition of demand. In economics, it's not only about what you want, it's about what you want and can buy that counts. Now that we know what demand means, let's learn how demand affects our behavior. The law of demand is pretty easy to understand because you experience it every time you go shopping. If something is cheap, you'll want to buy more. If it's expensive, you'll buy less. That's the law of demand at work. The price and the quantity demanded have a negative or indirect relationship. That means when one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa, assuming that nothing else changes, or, in other words, ceteris paribus. But have you ever stopped to think why that is? It's because of diminishing marginal utility. Remember, marginal utility is basically the benefit you get from consuming each additional product. And the law of demand tells us that there is a decreasing marginal utility. Think about it. Let's say you're really hungry, so you go to a restaurant and order yourself a delicious, juicy burger. How much happiness did that burger bring you? Probably a lot. So, in other words, we can say that the burger has high utility. But now let's look at the margin. What starts to happen as you consume additional units? Let's say you enjoyed the burger so much that you ordered another. Now, the second one was also just as delicious as the first burger, but because you already had one, you weren't as hungry when you ate the second one. So it's unlikely that the second burger gave you as much benefit as the first. So the second burger gave you less utility than the first burger. Now imagine you eat a third burger. Now you've eaten so much that you actually start to feel sick, and you really have to force yourself to finish the third burger. Now your benefit from the burgers has dropped to almost zero. So we can see the decreasing marginal utility. You get less and less utility or benefit from each unit you consume. And because of this decreasing marginal utility, businesses need to drop the price in order to get you to buy more. This is why you often see buy two, get one free sales. Businesses are trying to get you to buy more by making the price cheaper. Thinking about the benefits is a good way to think about demand. You can think of the demand curve as a benefits curve. This will come in handy in later units when we learn about externalities. The demand curve illustrates the benefits that come from consuming the product. And since we have diminishing marginal benefits, you can understand why we have a downward sloping demand curve. And even if you forget while drawing your diagrams, remember to label your demand curve as D. That's D as in down, and you'll never get it wrong. Now, of course, everyone is going to have different amounts of benefits from a product depending on their situation. In our hamburger example, the amount of utility you'll get will depend on how hungry you are. Therefore, people are going to have different prices that they are willing to pay. So there is a difference between individual demands. The price you are willing to pay may not be the same as someone else. This is called individual demand, and it shows the demand for one single consumer. But if you put all the individual demand curves together, then you would get market demand. It is all the individual demand added together and combined into one curve. You add all the individual quantities demanded at a given price. Market demand is very useful information, and businesses will use it to set prices and production levels. Now, we need to make an important distinction between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. They sound very similar, so a lot of students get them confused, but they are totally different. When someone says a change in quantity demanded, they're talking about a change in quantity caused by a change in price. So, just as we learned from the law of demand, when the price goes down, demand goes up, and vice versa. On a diagram, this is represented by a movement along the existing demand curve. We are talking about a different quantity at a different price. So the point on the curve changes, but the curve itself does not. This is a change in quantity demanded. When someone says a change in demand, they are talking about a change in quantity caused by factors other than the price. This will shift the entire demand curve, because now we are talking about a different quantity at the same price. For that, we need to draw a completely new line. The factors that shift the demand curve are called non-price determinants. So, what are some factors that would make you buy more or less things other than just the price? The most obvious non-price determinant is income. Think about it. Imagine you won the lottery and suddenly became rich. You would buy more things, right? This is going to shift the demand curve to the right, and the quantity of things you buy will increase even though the prices of those things stay the same, which is why we call it a non-price determinant. The price isn't affecting your buying decisions. You're rich. You don't care what the price is. And once you spend all your money and become poor again, which is exactly what happens to most people that win the lottery, then your demand curve will shift back, since you'll buy less things even though the price stays the same. But interestingly, this isn't true for all products. Sometimes a higher income will lead to a decrease in demand for certain products and vice versa. That sounds counterintuitive, but think about it. What do rich people not buy? Bus tickets, instant noodles, secondhand cars, or secondhand anything, really. These are called inferior goods. As income increases, demand for these products goes down. So then our demand curve shifts to the left. And if income decreases, demand for these products goes up. So our demand curve shifts to the right. But normally, as income increases, demand for most products will increase. So we call these products normal goods. These are most of the things that you see when you walk through the mall. Nike shoes, MacBooks, Starbucks coffee, Louis Vuitton handbags, and so on. As your income increases, you'll buy more of these things, so the demand curve shifts to the right. And as your income decreases, your demand for these things will also decrease, shifting the demand curve to the left. So be careful with income as a non-price determinant. How it shifts the demand curve depends on whether it's a normal good or an inferior good. Another non-price determinant that affects what people buy is consumer preferences and tastes. These changes often don't follow strict logic, and many are downright irrational or unpredictable, and are a big reason why having a long-term successful business is so difficult. What is popular today may not be tomorrow. These shifts are often driven by trends, social media, nostalgia, or pure hype, rather than actual need or value. A good example of this is Stanley Cups. Although just a normal insulated drinking cup with many others like it on the market, Stanley Cups became wildly famous through social media trends and influencer marketing. They became so popular that people were camping outside of stores in order to be in line for the next shipment. Some people were even scalping them, buying them in stores and then reselling them online for as much as 6 times the original price. Fights even broke out at stores when there weren't enough. That's right, people were punching each other to pay $55 for a reusable cup. You can't predict stuff like this. But you can predict how it's going to affect the demand curve. Obviously, as certain products become trendy and more people want to buy them, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. If the product becomes less popular, then that's going to shift the demand curve to the left. The next non-price determinant is future expectations. Sometimes people will buy more or less of something depending on what they think will happen in the future. Now, a lot of times this is actually based on price, but it is future prices and not the current price that affects the buying decision, so it is still considered a non-price determinant. For example, if your president has announced that he will drastically increase tariffs, taxes on imported goods, and you know that after that happens, the price of that laptop you wanted to buy, which is made in China, is going to be much more expensive after the tariffs, then you'll probably buy the laptop before the tariffs go into effect. This will shift the demand curve to the right because consumers will buy more when they think the price will increase in the future. But it's not always about price expectations. It could also be about what is going on in the world. For instance, in March 2020, as the COVID-19 virus spread globally and governments began to impose lockdowns, people started panic buying to stock up on essentials. And because people weren't sure how long the lockdowns were going to last, the tendency was to buy more than you needed. But as more people did that, some people got scared that there wouldn't be enough for them. So this drove demand to outrageous levels. For example, the demand for toilet paper tripled overnight, and supply chains couldn't keep up with the demand. Toilet paper aisles in supermarkets were completely wiped out. People were lining up before dawn to be first in line to buy new shipments. Stores started implementing limits on how much one customer could buy. Fights broke out. People started reselling toilet paper online for 10x the price. So, as you can see, because consumers thought that they might not be able to buy these basic necessities in the future, they bought more. This caused a shift in the demand curve to the right based on future expectations. Another non-price determinant is simply the number of consumers in an economy. Obviously, the more consumers you have, the more products they will buy. So as the number of consumers increases, the demand will increase, shifting the demand curve to the right. This is an important one to keep in mind, as many countries in the world today are facing serious population decline. What happens to a country's economy when there's no one to buy the products? The price of related goods is still a non-price determinant because it doesn't deal with the price of the good itself, but other goods related to that product. For example, think about a mouse. You only buy a mouse if you have a computer, right? By itself, the mouse is useless. So it makes sense that if the demand for computers increases, the demand for mice also increases. Two products like these that are often used together are called complementary products. Let's say we have two complementary goods, good A and good B. If the price of good A rises, then the demand for good B falls. And if the price of good A falls, then the demand for good B rises. And because the economy is so interconnected, there's a lot more complementary products than you might realize. Potatoes and ketchup, coffee and coffee creamer, cars and gasoline. Phones have a lot of complementary products: chargers, cases, phone banks, SIM cards, data plans. The tourism industry has a lot. If airline tickets are cheaper, more people will travel, which means the demand for hotels, restaurants, taxis, malls, entertainment venues, money exchange vendors, and so on, along with things like sunscreen, suitcases, sunglasses, hats, swimsuits. The list goes on and on. The demand for all of these things will increase simply because the price of plane tickets becomes cheaper. And once you understand how interconnected the economy is, then you can start to appreciate how complex the whole system is and how making small changes to any one thing can cause big changes in other areas. Besides complementary goods, we also have substitute goods. These are two goods that satisfy the same need and can therefore be used interchangeably. The classic example here is Coke and Pepsi. Most people have a preference, but that's mostly because the price of both are the same. But even if people prefer Coke, if Coca-Cola raised their prices enough, then more people would switch over and begin to drink Pepsi. In other words, the demand for Pepsi would change, even though Pepsi didn't change their price, making this a non-price determinant. So let's say we have two substitute goods, good X and good Y. If the price of good X rises, then the demand for good Y rises. And if the price of good X falls, then the demand for good Y falls. And that about does it for the non-price determinants. Be sure you understand not only why, but also how each of them shifts the demand curve. For the SL students, you can stop here. For the HL students, sorry, but we still have a bit more to go, but hang in there. We're almost done. For the HL students, we need to take a deeper look at the law of demand. The good news is we already covered these concepts earlier in the video, but it's important for you to understand their importance in explaining the law of demand. There are three assumptions that we need to consider in order to understand how the law of demand works. The first one is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Remember the guy eating all the hamburgers? That's the law of diminishing marginal utility at work. Once again, utility is the satisfaction gained from consumption, and marginal utility is the extra satisfaction from consuming one more unit. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that as a consumer consumes more and more units of a good, the additional satisfaction, marginal utility, derived from each successive unit decreases. Because consumers gain less and less extra satisfaction from each additional unit, they will only be willing to buy more units if the price of the good falls. This supports why the demand curve slopes down. The next two assumptions are the income and substitution effects. These concepts were explained as part of the non-price determinant sections, but now let's look at how they are alternative explanations of the law of demand. As we talked about in the non-price determinant portion of the video, a person's level of income changes their demand. If their income increases, they have more money, so they will buy more. So we can say the demand increases. That makes sense, right? Rich people buy more things. And this behavior can be used to explain the law of demand, because the same thing happens even if you don't get rich. Let me explain. Instead of thinking about the amount of money a person has, instead think about what they can buy. This is called purchasing power.
Oh, yes.
And of course, rich people have a lot of purchasing power. But your purchasing power can increase without your income increasing. How? When things become cheaper, you can afford to buy more of them, right? So even though your income stays the same, your purchasing power has increased. And if your purchasing power increases, you usually will buy more. And if your purchasing power decreases, you will buy less. So as you can see, this is just a different way to explain the law of demand. As the price falls, your purchasing power increases. so the demand increases, and vice versa. So the income effect shows us that it's not really about what your income is, but more about what your income can buy that causes a change in demand. As we talked about earlier in the video, a change in price of a good will change the demand of its substitute good. If Coke raises their price, the demand for Pepsi will increase. This is because even if Pepsi doesn't change its price, it is now relatively cheaper. This also demonstrates the inverse relationship of the law of demand. As the price decreases, demand increases, even if the price is relative to the substitute good and doesn't actually change. And I think that's enough for now. As I said earlier, demand is a very important concept in economics, so we still have a lot to cover. We'll continue to learn about demand throughout the course, but for now, you just need to know the basics. After this video, you should now be able to explain the law of demand and the relationship between price and quantity demanded, draw a demand curve, explain the relationship between individual demand and market demand, analyze the non-price determinants of demand as causes of demand curve shifts, using diagrams distinguish between movements along the demand curve and shifts of the demand curve. And higher-level students should be able to explain the assumptions underlying the law of demand. If you can't do all of these, go back and watch the video again until you understand it. As always, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll get to them. See you next time.